The first time Elio saw her, he mistook the way she leaned against the bakery window for a reflection. A girl-shaped hush folded into the glass, as if the city had cast her there and forgotten to claim her back. The morning was wet, streets rinsed clean after a night storm. He had gone out early for milk and the good bread that sells out before 9, walking with his collar up and his thoughts gathered like loose thread around nothing in particular. He nearly walked past her, then stopped, then did that small backward step people do when they think they know something but can't name it yet. The glass caught his face beside hers, his tired eyes, the faint shaving cut on his jaw, and her, hair gathered into a messy knot, rain tapping its soft secret rhythm on the awning above them. She stared at the trays inside as if the cakes were maps and she had somewhere to be. He realized he'd seen her before without seeing, which unsettled him, the feeling of a book half remembered on a shelf, a melody that rises and refuses to give you its name. He remembered the bus stop near the river a week or two ago, where a girl with the same posture had stood with a paper bag pressed to her chest. He remembered a library at closing, the same shade of cardigan moving down an aisle, touching spines lightly, as if apologizing to each book she left behind. She turned, not startled, just aware. Her gaze touched his and then moved over him calmly, the way rain moves past eaves, not searching, simply falling. "You're in line?" she asked, although no one else was there. Yes," he said, though there was no line as such, just an invisible agreement that they both wanted the same warm loaf and the scent of butter turning corners in the small shop. He opened the door for her, and the bell made that kind sound it always made, the sound he'd secretly loved since childhood, when bells and bread meant his mother's good mood. Inside, the air was a soft rush of heat and cinnamon. The glass case glowed. A baker in a flour-dusted apron wrapped the morning into paper parcels. The girl traced a fingertip over a fogged patch of glass and then caught herself, slipping her hand into her coat pocket. There was something diffident in the gesture, and also something stubborn. Elio ordered his loaf. She ordered the same. "And 2 of those small lemon tarts," she added, pointing, and the baker looked delighted, as if she'd plucked a struggling word from his mouth for him. When they stepped back into the damp light, he made a small, ridiculous decision that felt like stepping off a curb without checking for traffic. "There's a bench under the plane trees," he said. "If you want to share a tart before the rain figures itself out." The sentence embarrassed him even as he spoke it, but she didn't laugh. She looked at the sky, the slow unbuttoning of clouds, then at the tarts, then at him. Something like caution walked behind her eyes, but it kept its distance. "All right," she said, "but only if we pretend we are not having dessert before breakfast." "Obviously," he said, relief coming out as a crooked smile. They sat on a damp bench that gave the day back to them in scents. Wet bark, city stone, the faint metallic smell of a tram wire singing somewhere above the boulevard. He tore the tart in half with the gravity of a surgeon and handed her the better portion. She bit into it with care, the way one speaks to a sleeping dog, tender and respectful. The first taste made her close her eyes very slightly. A small crease he hadn't noticed near her left eyebrow eased. "You've had a morning already," he said, not as a question. "Doesn't everyone?" she said, and then, after a quiet beat, "I started earlier than I meant to." Her voice was low, a little hoarse, like someone who had cried not long ago or slept badly for a week. He didn't ask which. He noticed the way her knuckles pressed white against the paper bag, and how, when she tried to loosen them, the tension replaced itself like water filling the shape of your hand after you lift it from a basin. He had known that particular self-repair. It was the habit of people who carry more than they can set down. There was something gentle and soothing simply in sitting there, the two of them facing the street instead of each other, letting their shoulders align to a truce with the morning. "I'm Elio," he said at last, because a name felt like a small umbrella you could offer someone in stubborn weather. "June," she said, and the name fit her perfectly, a month that is a promise and a memory at once. He had the sense of a hinge, some small private door inside him, swinging open on quiet, oiled pins. He had not expected the morning to do anything of the sort. He had expected to go on carrying his own ordinary weight, the work emails, the boxes in his apartment he still hadn't unpacked a year after the move, the hiss and ache where absence lives in the ribs. The day rearranged itself around her name. They ate in a lazy truce with the drizzle. She was the sort of person whose silences weren't empty. They were rooms with windows. He could stand in them and see a river, a hill, a far line of buildings catching the first stroking light. Around them, the city did what cities do. People invented their urgency and paced it into the pavement. A man with a dachshund argued with himself quietly and then gave up. Traffic lights rehearsed their slow, patient ritual of letting things go, letting other things arrive. June stood first, smoothing the corner of the pastry bag as if it were a piece of paper receiving its final sentence. "I have to go," she said, almost apologetic. "I promised someone to bring bread." "You have a good bread face," he said, then cursed himself internally for being the sort of man who said things like that. But she smiled, the kind of smile that begins in the eyes and keeps its secrets there, and he knew he would measure the rest of his day by that fraction of light. "Maybe I'll see you," she said, like someone leaving a note in a book for a stranger. "Maybe you will," he said, like someone finding it later and thinking, yes, this was meant. He watched her walk away, the city collecting her into its folds, the wet hem of her coat, the steady sense of a person locating herself in a map you couldn't read yet. When the tram passed and the people crossing blurred his view of her, he felt the familiar twin sensations he'd learned to live with, the tug of curiosity, the discipline of letting things go. He had trained himself in the art of release. For 2 years he had practiced not reaching out to what would not stay. A habit he built the way one learns to favor an injured ankle, the body remembering before the mind does. He had lost someone once in a summer so bright the grief was almost rude. The city knows how to carry grief. It gives you storefronts to stare at, pigeons to curse, schedules to keep. But grief knows the detours. It finds the coffee line, the evening light on the railing, the exact place where you tie your shoes and pause to look at nothing. It waits in the softened half of sleep and asks, very gently, whether you are ready to set anything down. He was not. Not until the bench and the tart and the odd recalibration of the morning. At lunchtime, he passed the library and paused in the doorway, not to go in, but to allow himself the theatre of coincidence. He didn't see her. He did see a notice board with a flyer pinned crookedly, "Community garden volunteers needed, no experience necessary, Saturdays." He thought about soil under fingernails, the way plants trust you without evidence. He looked up at the second-floor windows and had the absurd idea of a life arranged by small paper signs you mostly ignore. He went back to work, design drafts and calibration, lines that needed to behave, and let the day carry him past its ordinary markers. But the memory of her sat with him the way a song refuses to be unlearned. He drew building lines that, if you had the taste for noticing, softened around the edges as if the corners themselves could be tender. That evening, walking home past the river, he saw the bench again, and then something, the smallest bright rectangle of a note anchored under a pebble. He almost didn't look. He had long ago decided not to go through the world expecting the world to owe him anything. But the white flicker caught his seeing self, and he stepped closer. The paper was damp at the edges, handwriting like the kind of rain you can only hear if you stop talking. He read, "Thank you for pretending about breakfast. J." He stood there with the note, the river occupying its slow, patient fact beside him. The city had found a smaller heartbeat and loaned it to him. He looked around, half expecting she'd be behind a tree watching him read, but the trees were only trees. He folded the note, a careful movement, as if creases could be kindness, and slipped it in his pocket. He slept with that pocket draped across a chair, as if the note required its own room to breathe. Saturday, he went to the community garden. It turned out a lot of people believe they can't keep anything alive and come anyway, because the dirt doesn't mind. He signed his name and was handed a pair of gloves 2 sizes too big. He looked up and June was there, hair in a braid that had already given up and scattered itself on her jacket collar, kneeling beside a bed of damp soil with seedlings surrounding her like small green ears listening. He felt the clean shock of recognition and the quieter, older shock of relief. The world had not invented her to heal something in him. She existed without his story. She looked up, and the look on her face said she had not expected to see him, and was pleased anyway, a rare and generous combination. "You're here," she said. "I am," he said. "No experience necessary," it said. "Except patience," she said. "That one is compulsory." He knelt beside her. The soil was cool, a soothing weight against his palms. She showed him how to cup the seedlings so the stems didn't break, how to settle them in, how to tuck the earth around them, the way you tuck a child's blanket. His hands learned quickly, glad to be told something simple and true. They worked quietly, and he understood what the flyer had not said, that the garden collected people who were trying to put themselves back, soft hands on small, fragile lives, teaching their own bones to be gentle again. She told him to water the bed from the edges inward so the flow didn't collapse the middle. "You teach the soil to absorb," she said, "not surrender." He stored the sentence in a careful place. At noon there was tea, a circle of mismatched mugs, someone's dog resting with his chin between his paws. June sat cross-legged, elbows on knees, mug between her palms. The sunlight was made of April, which is to say it believed in things with a cautious optimism. She looked around at the others with an expression he recognized, gratitude that doesn't announce itself. Her laugh, when she gave it, came out low and shy, and each time he thought, "I want to know what opened that door. I want to remember where the hinge sits." They cleaned up, washing the dirt from their fingers, leaving a little in the lines on purpose to remember. She turned to go, and he found himself blurting, "There's a small cafe near the river, the one with the blue chairs no one sits in because they're always wet. If you want—" "Yes," she said before he finished, as if she had learned not to let hesitation steal the places she meant to go. They sat with wet chairs and coffee that warmed their hands. She took her time, as if she'd decided they could be strangers in a way that let them be honest. The river made its long, peaceful sound, a soft body thinking. He had never been good at the first lines of stories. He was better at middles, that familiar steady where you carry the weight together. But he tried. "I moved here last year," he said. "After—" He stopped. The sentence had a cliff in it. He looked down and did not know if jumping would teach him to fly or remind him that he could fall. She waited gently, and somehow the waiting was an answer in itself, a soft permission that did not pry. "After," he said again, and let the rest stay where it was for now. "I design small spaces to make them look like larger spaces. It's a job which on certain mornings feels like a mercy and on other mornings a joke." "I like small spaces," she said. "Because they're honest about their size. Because you notice one thing at a time. Because nothing echoes too long." She traced the rim of her cup. "I teach music to children who are afraid of making sounds." "How do you teach that?" "You let them play the wrong note so gently it sounds right." He smiled, and something in his chest unclenched. He wanted to ask everything at once, and also nothing at all. He wanted to sit there forever, letting the river write its long letter to the sea while they borrowed its margins. He wanted to learn the healing math of her quiet, how it added room to a room and subtracted noise without leaving absence. When they parted, it was with the feeling of a thread pulled through fabric without snagging. He took the long way home, got caught in a small rain, watched it stain the pavement darker and then fade. In his apartment he put the note, "Thank you for pretending about breakfast," on his fridge with a magnet shaped like a ship. He did not read it again. He knew where it was. That was enough to change the air. The next week became a gentle kind of waiting he had never allowed himself. He saw her at the garden, at the bakery, in the library, where she shelved music scores in the quiet hour before closing. He learned that she walked with care on uneven sidewalks, not to protect herself but the world, as if she did not want to disturb even the smallest habit of stone. He learned the names of the children she taught by the way her mouth softened when she spoke them. He learned that when she paused before answering, she wasn't hiding. She was choosing a word that wouldn't bruise what it touched. The city's noise did not lessen. It did, however, acquire a harmony, soft, tender, peaceful, the way a crowded room becomes gentle when the person you love steps into it. He didn't call it love, not yet. He called it the good ache. He called it the part of the day that breathed. On an evening when the sky failed to decide whether to be violet or grey, they sat on the steps of the museum and watched people hold umbrellas badly. She tucked her chin into her scarf and said, "There are things I haven't said." "You don't owe me anything," he said, too quickly, because the part of him that feared edges flinched. "No," she said, "but I owe myself a life that isn't quiet for the wrong reasons." The sentence settled between them, a small, brave animal. He looked at her hands folded in her lap. He wanted to cover them with his, not to stop them from shaking, but to say, "I am here while you shake." "Tomorrow," she said. "After the lesson with Mia. The cafe with the blue chairs." "I'll be there," he said, and the words were a place he could stand. He walked home in a rain that did finally decide itself. He tilted his face to it. The drops were cool and patient. He thought of the seedlings and the way she had taught him to water from the edges, letting the middle learn to drink in its own time. He thought of his grief, the shape it kept making. He did not push it away. He simply placed beside it the fact of her voice and the promise of tomorrow, and how inside his chest something had begun to mend, not in the loud way of miracles, but in the soft arithmetic of presence added to presence. And because lately the world had started to surprise him in gentle, improbable ways, he let it. He went inside, opened the window to let the rain smell in, and for the first time in 2 years put on the old record with the scratches he used to hate. The needle found its loop. The hiss was no longer a flaw, but proof of having lived, of having played and played until the song grew its edges. If this beginning found you in a quiet place and gave it a warmer light, stay with us. Like, leave a small comment, and subscribe so the next part finds you when it's ready to be heard. The next morning, the city wore its sunlight like a shirt someone ironed badly and then decided to love anyway. June met him at the cafe with the blue chairs and carried no visible luggage except the carefulness of her posture. She placed her cup down as if putting something fragile on a shelf. He noticed a small ink stain on her thumb. He liked it without knowing why. It suggested she had been writing, which meant she had given shape to her thinking before handing it over. They began with easy things, letting the rhythm of spoons and small birds wind a leash around their patience. He told her about the apartment with the stubborn window that jammed in cold weather, how he'd learned to breathe warmth on the latch before asking it to open. She told him about the child who only played in the key of C because it was the first letter of cat and corduroy, her 2 good words for the week. He felt himself smiling without it costing anything. When she was ready, she placed her hands flat on the table and made them still. "I was engaged," she said, the phrase wearing the dust of a year. "We called it off last spring. It wasn't exactly a shock, but it was. I had a plan where love was a calendar, and every day had a box to check." He breathed carefully, keeping his attention on the hinge of her sentences. The part of him that had been left once in a summer light remembered the burn, the precision of it. His chest understood. His chest made room. "We were good at the beginning," she said. "We did the thing where you collect each other's stories like seashells. Then one day I noticed I wasn't listening for the sound of the sea anymore. I was counting how many shells I had. He started speaking like a list. I started answering like an email." She looked up at him with a rueful smile. "My therapist said I have a talent for persevering where I should choose. I kept choosing the same day over and over, hoping it would become a better day if I wore it long enough." He pictured it. A woman in a dress of calendar squares, the fabric thin in places where insistence rubs and rubs. He felt protective anger, not at the man, but at the idea that a woman like June had felt she had to shrink her listening to fit inside a life. "What ended it?" he asked gently. "My mother's hands," she said, surprising him. "She was washing a bowl in our sink. The light did that forgiving thing evening light does. I looked at her hands and I felt this urge to cry. Not because I was sad, because I wanted what her hands had. A story that kept working even when no one was applauding. And then she put the bowl down and turned and said, as if she had reached into me and pulled out the thread herself, 'June, you can't keep choosing the version of yourself that hurts less. Choose the one that is true, even if it shakes.'" He closed his eyes for a moment. "Your mother is a terrifyingly accurate person." "She is," June said, and laughed, the sound soft and tender. "So I told him I couldn't marry him. We were kind about it. We were also a little cowardly. We pretended we would stay friends immediately. We didn't. And there was this space after, the size of a room, the size of a building, where all my plans echoed and then fell quiet. He reached a hand halfway across the table and stopped there, an offering without trespass. She watched the hand, then the face it belonged to. The space between them felt peaceful, not empty. She placed her hand palm down beside his, close enough that the warmth crossed, not touching, a gentle exchange, a practice. "When I met you," she said, "I thought, here is a person who has learned to breathe with his pain without making it everyone's weather." He swallowed. "I lost someone," he said simply. 2 summers ago. A car doing what cars do when a text is more urgent than a red light. He didn't say the name. He didn't have to. June waited. He let the memory lift its head without feeding it. "I thought grief would be loud, like a siren. It turned out to be soft and endless, like static between radio stations. Some days I could tune it out by turning the knob. Some days I couldn't." She turned her hand, the back of her fingers barely brushing his wrist, just there, a presence that eased without insisting. "I'm sorry," she said, and he believed the weight of it. "My father died when I was 9, she added, not as if trying to match him sorrow for sorrow, but like someone taking a seat beside you on a step, so the step becomes wide enough for 2. He had this way of whistling when he came in the door, and for a whole year after I would hear it in other people's mouths. I forgave strangers for not being him." He exhaled, a steadying, "Do you still?" "Sometimes," she said. "But mostly I whistle to myself when I get home, not because I think he's coming back, because I'm the person who needs to hear it now." That image, June opening her door to a soft, faithful sound, shifted something in him, aligning it. He understood the sentence she'd spoken in the garden about teaching soil to absorb, not surrender. He thought, she has been practicing life. The day stretched around their talking. They walked the river path and let the pauses be as full as the words. He noticed how she noticed, a patch of sun on a bicycle seat, a child in a red jacket carrying a stick as if he'd invented it, the way the river threw light onto the underside of the stone bridge, a quiet applause no one remembers to thank. She bought pears at the market, as if she were choosing the future. He watched her thumb the skin and thought, I want to be the person beside this choosing. In the weeks that followed, their rhythm became a soft scaffolding around which both of them could rest. They practiced an honesty made of sentences that started with "I felt" rather than "you made." They made small rituals that honored the day without crowding it. A shared apple on the museum steps, a slow, peaceful walk on Tuesdays after her last lesson, a tender exchange of playlists with notes that read like prayers. Try this. I heard you in it. This one is gentle when the trains are loud. He learned her fears the way one learns a neighbor's schedule. Not to intrude, but to offer the light at the right time. She was wary of promises that sounded like contracts. He stopped saying always and started saying, I'm here now. She disliked loud endings. They agreed to depart from places before the lights went ugly. She remembered the exact date and hour when she confessed to her ex that she did not know what she wanted. Some Mondays carried that shadow. On those he brought her cinnamon tea and let her talk about everything except that, until she wanted to, She learned his triggers, where grief sharpened unexpectedly, the high, breaking laugh in a jazz song, the smell of cut limes, the particular blue of a certain late summer evening. On those nights, she hummed instead of playing the record, and her humming was the space a person makes when they know the walls by heart and aren't afraid to touch them gently. And because they were not characters invented for each other's healing, but people with weather of their own, they had a fight. It was about nothing first, and then about everything, the way rain becomes a river without apology. He cancelled dinner with short notice because of a client emergency he didn't respect himself for accepting. She said softly that she understood. He heard, through the filter of his old life, a shadow of someone else's accusation and braced against it as if she had thrown something. The next day he was late to the garden. She had already left. He texted and she did not answer because she was in a movie with her phone off, which in his old vocabulary translated into avoidance. He spent 2 hours feeding stories to a worry that ate well. When they finally met, after a scatter of missed messages and a tram stuck between stations, he was brittle with rehearsed sentences. She stood with her hands in her pockets. The city made extraneous noise around them. His voice came out too loud. Hers came out too quiet. He said something like, "You could have told me you needed space." And she flinched as if he'd mistaken her for someone else on purpose. "I turned my phone off to watch a film," she said, and then, because a long-ago version of love had trained her to explain when she should not have to, she added, "with Mia and her mother." "Oh," he said, an idiot syllable carrying entire apologies. The hinge of the moment was right there. He could see it. Either step through and own the clumsy old fear, or let it swing into his face. He took a breath, counting backwards from 5, the way his therapist had taught him, the way oxygen chooses the lungs when you let it. "I'm sorry," he said. "I get loud when I'm scared." He smiled without humor. "I forget that I am no longer auditioning." She looked at him, the steady mercy in her gaze making room for both of their histories. "I get quiet when I think I am failing," she said. "Then I make myself smaller to fit back into what I promised, even if no one asked me to promise it." They stood there, 2 people with old instincts reporting for duty, and then, right there on the pavement, retrained them. They laughed softly at themselves. He reached out and she let him take her hand. There was nothing dramatic in it. The sun made its ordinary fall across the buildings. A tram bell chimed. Their fingers folded and did not flinch. The city, that unembarrassed witness, went on being itself. "Next time," he suggested, "we put phones on airplane mode and tell each other we are okay before the film starts. And you tell your clients that dinner with a person you care about is an emergency," she said, an eyebrow lifting in a friendly threat. "Yes," he said, "I will." Little by little, the days braided into something that felt serene, peaceful, as if the week itself had learned their names. He found himself at her door sometimes with flowers that looked like a field pretending not to be a bouquet. She came to his apartment with soup in a jar when his back hurt from carrying too many models up too many stairs. They read aloud to each other badly and enjoyed the badness. He taught her the trick of the stuck window. She taught him to whistle a tune that meant home. They began to touch, without thinking about touching, a hand on a sleeve, a knee resting against a knee at the museum, a drowsy shoulder leaning at the end of a long day. The touches were soft and soothing, not because they feared breaking, but because they respected what had been broken before. He learned to sleep again, not all at once, not every night, but enough to notice that morning felt less like a weight and more like a door set gently ajar. He dreamed sometimes of the woman he had lost. The dreaming softened. It became like sitting with an old photograph in good light, not a wound, not a demand, an acknowledgement. In one dream she handed him a small paper boat and said, "It was always meant to float." And when he woke, he understood that some goodbyes are gifts disguised as storms. June took him to the music room at the school one late afternoon, when the hallway smelled of paint and pencil shavings. The piano was an old upright with a temperament, the pedals worn by 1,000 patient feet. She sat and played for him, nothing virtuosic, a hymn without words. He felt the room remember childhood all around them. He watched her hands find the keys without hunting. He watched her shoulders drop as if, for a handful of measures, gravity had remembered how to be kind. When she finished, she didn't look up immediately. He stood and touched the silvered back of her head with care, a palm placed like a benediction. "I want to learn that," he said quietly. She played the melody again, single notes, saying the names, C, E, G, as if introducing shy friends. He repeated them, and his fingers were clumsy in the way of all beginnings, but she was patient, and the room was patient, and even the old piano seemed to offer its tired body to their hope. The small success, when he caught the phrase, made him grin like a boy. She smiled back, which felt like watching light find its old address. There were other disclosures, because life does not stack its soft things without slipping a few sharp edges in for grammar. Her ex wrote once, a measured, polite cruelty disguised as civility. She showed the message to Elio not to ask what to do, but to practice not solving other people's needs. He said, "We can decide whether to answer after dinner." And they went to eat pears and cheese by the window, and by the time the plates were empty, the urgency had drained from the message like bathwater. They deleted it and read a page of poetry aloud in terrible accents instead. His father called from a town that still used Sunday as a verb. The call loosened the old rope in him that always tied approval to breath. He sat on the floor while June folded laundry on his bed and listened to his father talk about a neighbor's fence and the price of eggs. He said, "I'm seeing someone," in a voice that didn't expect applause and wasn't braced against derision. His father said, "I'm glad," in a tone that was so simple it startled him. After, with the call ended, he put his forehead against June's hip, and she placed her hand on his hair and said nothing, which is what acceptance sounds like when it is done right. And always, under their dailiness, the earlier conversation hummed like a ground note, the promise that they would speak the truth even when it shook. He named his fear of bargaining with the universe. "If I love again, something will be taken." She named her fear of deserving only what she could maintain. They let those fears sit at the table. They fed them soup and put them to bed like difficult children. They did not let them drive. When spring unfolded itself like a letter it had been saving all winter, June led him to the roof of her building. The city presented itself without embarrassment, all its mistakes and stutters dressed in sudden green. Pigeons strutted with their unexpected iridescence. On the next roof over, a girl released a handful of helium balloons and then laughed, head thrown back, as if forgiving herself an old sin. June opened a small bag and removed 2 kites. One was a bright kite with a tail like a line of commas. The other was plain white. "My father taught me," she said. "He said flying a kite is practicing wanting without holding." They let the wind find the kites. They held and then released, ran and then paused. The sky took, the sky returned. The string thrummed like a vein. June watched her white kite climb and said, "I think I'm ready to live in the middle of things, not at the beginning where everything is promise, and not at the end where everything is memory." Elio watched the bright kite arc and thought, "So am I." They did not kiss then. They stood with the wind in their sleeves and let the wordless answer be accurate. The kiss came later, in a doorway when their hands were full of groceries and neither wanted to drop the coffee, so they leaned in awkwardly, and then the awkwardness changed temperature, turned warm and sure and tender. It was not a movie kiss. It was a life kiss, a little clumsy, a little breathless, a lot true. He felt his body remember everything it had been afraid to want. She felt a quiet inside her that used to be a warning turn into a room with a window. They stood like that until the key fell from his hand and clinked on the floor, and they laughed against each other's mouths, and the laughter made space for the second kiss, which was better, which was theirs. After, she rested her forehead against his collarbone. "There are days when the door to sadness opens without my permission," she murmured, as if confessing to a fault she no longer planned to fix. "I might need to stand there for a while." "I know," he said. "I'll stand in the hall. We can hold hands under the door." She breathed out, a soft relief that made him understand, with a sudden bright certainty, that you do not heal people by stealing their pain. You heal by bearing witness while they set it down, piece by piece, until their hands are free. The days were not perfect, the days were good, which is different and better. They woke into morning with ordinary errands and extraordinary grace. Small, peaceful things stacked themselves like smooth stones on a riverbank. Tea steeped exactly right, a note tucked into a coat pocket, a joke about the neighbor's cat who tried to adopt them every Thursday. The softness in their life was not fragile. It had tensile strength. It held. And if, sometimes, late at night, Elio woke with his heart racing, the old sirens swelling, he learned to sit at the window and breathe in a pattern that told his body there was no fire to put out. June would sit beside him, knee touching knee, and hum that hymn again, the melody that found the room at 4 a.m. and refused to leave without lighting a lamp. One morning, while they watered the garden, a child ran past with a plastic crown and declared them king and queen of something no one could quite make out. June bowed solemnly. Elio, with the watering can tilted carefully, raised it like a scepter. They did not correct the child. They accepted their appointment with the respect it deserved and washed the soil dark around the roots. If love was a garden, they were learning how to tend it, not with grand gestures that raise the earth for the sake of spectacle, but with gentle routines, soft persistence, peaceful presence. They were learning which leaves to pinch, which to let be, when to thin the crowded shoots so all could breathe. They were learning to leave the middle alone sometimes, watering the edges and trusting the center to drink in its own time. They were learning the difference between surrender and absorption. Under the blue chairs, in the cafe, the note remained on the board, a new pin, the paper less crisp. Strangers smiled at its brevity without knowing its whole book. June touched it once before they left, a fingertip resting lightly, like gratitude. They walked home with bread between them and a sky that looked willing. Their shadows went ahead like loyal dogs. He thought of the hinge that had first swung on that rain-damp bench. He thought of the word he had not yet given himself permission to speak. He carried it with the bread, warm and fragrant and already necessary. He would say it when saying it would not be a demand, but a naming. For now, he said, "Pears?" "For now, pears," she said. And the day agreed, and the river, passing in its patient way, carried their reflections without argument. The morning of the storm that changed the story, June woke with a feeling she had not felt since childhood, the hum in the air that means the sky has decided to forgive, then warn, then forgive again. The city wore that dim alertness that comes when the weather insists on being the main character. She checked the window latch she had learned to coax. It was as steady as his breathing. Elio was already up, kettle on, the radio murmuring a weather report and then giving up. He moved in the kitchen like a person who has finally returned to a house he knows, reaching without thinking for the right drawer, the right cup. He handed her tea and looked at her the way people look at the sky just before lightning, steady, awake, aware of the possibility of brightness. "Big one," he said. She nodded. She had a rehearsal scheduled at the school for the spring recital. He had a meeting with a new client who loved glass the way birds fear it. The storm rearranged plans, as storms do. "Come with me," she said. "If they cancel, we can play the bad piano until the building sighs." He smiled and said yes, because somehow their lives had become a string of small yeses that added up to a path. By noon, the rain had become a curtain. The streets were a steady river of hurried decisions. The school sent a message: "We'll try to start early. Leave if needed." They took the tram and sat with damp shoulders touching, the ride that sweet blur of windows and people inventing purpose. At the school, the lights flickered and held. In the music room, the children were louder than usual, their noise the kind that says, "We are brave if we are together." June made a game of the storm. She taught them a rhythm that sounded like rain on glass, then turned it into a melody that made the air feel brave. Elio sat in the back and watched her conduct 15 small lives into one gentle sound. He felt his chest open and stay open. He thought of a future where their Saturdays were like this and found that the thought did not frighten him. The power cut at 4. No lights, just the storm and the piano's old, honest voice. Parents arrived early with umbrellas held like shields. June shepherded each child out to their people. The last to leave was Mia, who always tied her laces in perfect bows without looking. She hugged June as if saving a person from drowning. "You'll come tomorrow?" the child asked, and June said, "Yes," because promises spoken to 9-year-olds behave differently than other promises. They plant themselves. They stepped into the corridor as the emergency lights flickered, and that was when the day tipped. A crack ran through the ceiling tile above the stairwell, a slow, damp veining. June turned and saw the same hairline crack at the corner of the music room door. The building, built in a year that had believed in cheaper ways, had been asking for help for months. The storm made the request urgent. "Out!" Elio said, gently firm, that voice he saved for clarity. He had his hand at the small of her back, not pushing, just guiding. They were almost at the door when the crash came, a section of the ceiling giving up and throwing a tantrum on the hallway floor. Dust and wet fell in a sudden white rain. They ran the last 10 paces and burst into weather that seemed tame by comparison. Outside, the courtyard was a shallow lake. Parents yelled through rain to children who laughed because the world had offered them a story. Sirens on the street announced that grown-ups somewhere were stepping into their best selves. June checked her roster and counted absences like a litany, counting until the numbers became names and the names were safely accounted for. Back inside, they could hear water moving where water should not move. They looked at each other and knew the same thought. The music room. Instruments. Scores. The piano with its tired, faithful voice. June's face showed the question. Elio answered it without words. Yes. He followed her back, skirting the place where the ceiling had given its warning. They pushed the door and found the roof had started dripping into the far corner. A steady, apologetic trouble. June went to the cabinet and took the manuscripts, armfuls of patient paper that would not survive a second storm. Elio tipped the piano bench on its side so water wouldn't pool on the worn cushion. He pulled the plastic drop cloth from the painting closet and spread it over the instrument with a care that looked like gratitude. The room was dim. Rain wrote its monologue above them. She reached for the last stack of scores. Her notebook was there, the one with the ink stain's origin, and the ceiling gave another quiet sigh, a dark line widening. Elio was at her side before she asked. They moved as a pair, a small choreography that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with trust. They zipped the bag. They moved to the door. Behind them, the drop cloth sagged and caught water like a poor umbrella. The piano made a small sound, a chord pressed accidentally by the weight shifting. A place remembering how to sing. Outside, breathless, wet, absurdly happy in the way people are when a building might collapse but they have saved the sheet music, June leaned against the corridor wall and laughed. The sound ran ahead of the rain and turned the afternoon brave. Reckless, she said. Necessary, he said. She touched his cheek with rain-cold fingers. He leaned into the touch, warmed by it instantly. Sometimes that is all a climax is, pouring your warmth into someone's cold, letting them learn that heat is not a scarce resource. The city came back to itself slowly. That evening, their building's power returned and the storm walked off to find another argument. They made soup on a stove that clicked before it caught. They ate on the floor. At midnight, the street below filled with people singing because relief looks like chorus when you're tired enough. June lay with her head on his chest and said into his shirt, "I didn't know I could be this." She searched for the word, and he waited the way he had learned to wait. "Peaceful," she said at last, the sound the opposite of apology, "even when everything shakes." "It's not that the shaking stops," he said, smiling into her hair. "It's that we learn to dance without the floor being so important." She made a small, amused sound. "Look at you, turning architecture into poetry." "Don't tell my clients," he said. "I won't," she said. "I'm keeping you for myself." The next week, the school closed 2 floors for repairs. June taught in the library among the history books and the smell of dust that admits to being old. Elio redesigned a cramped loft for a woman who fostered cats and spoke to them as if they were difficult tenants, which perhaps they were. Life was, briefly, ordinary and completely different for being so. Then her ex arrived in the city. They saw him first as a message on her phone asking for coffee, closure, the decency of a conversation. June showed Elio the text. They read it twice. Her face was calm in that way. A face is calm when it has asked its hands not to tremble. "I can say no," she said. "You can say what is true," he said. "What is true," she said, "is that I don't want to find my old voice again for someone who only listens to the part of me that agrees with him." "Then don't," he said. But she was also the kind of person who believes in finishing songs. She met the ex at a cafe where people used laptops like shields. Elio waited in the park across the street and watched through trees the appropriate amount and then looked away. He trusted her. He also trusted his heart to find a new frightening if he concentrated on the old one. He sat on a bench and watched a woman teach a three-legged dog to navigate a curb with great care and less pity. June came out 30 minutes later. The look on her face was not sad. It was not triumph. It was something braver, relief without celebration. She sat beside him and leaned once, briefly, shoulder to shoulder. "He said he missed the way we made sense," she said. "And I said we often confused sense with symmetry." He asked if I had forgiven him for wanting a life I did not want. I said I had forgiven both of us for pretending the dress fit. He asked if I was happy. I said, I am learning not to monitor my happiness as if it were a patient. I told him I'm with someone and we're practicing wanting without holding. She looked at him then with a grin that bit itself back. "I stole your kite sentence." "Good," he said, pleased the way one is when a word you loved finds another home. How did he take it? "As if I had chosen a different language," she said. "I didn't try to translate." He kissed the top of her head. "Let him buy a dictionary." They walked. The city had found its warm weather. June's braid was a rope for bees. He felt the future as a series of rooms filling with ordinary light. He let himself imagine a winter together and didn't flinch. Later, at his apartment, he took from the closet a box he had not opened in 2 years. She watched him do it without stepping in. He set it on the table and lifted the lid, and they sorted the life he had kept there into what could be honored and what could be returned to the quiet. Photographs. A scarf. A book with a note in the margin that made him laugh suddenly because it was exactly the thought he had had at breakfast. June looked at the photograph of the woman he had loved and said very simply, she had kind eyes, which is the right sentence in such rooms. He put the scarf in a bag to donate. He placed the book on the shelf. He kept one photo, a small one of a smile that did not demand anything of him now. He closed the box and put it in the back of the closet where boxes go when their work is done. He turned to June and found her watching him in a way he had not been watched before. Not as a man to be solved, not as a problem to be softened, but as a person doing a brave thing and therefore allowed to look foolish and blessed and shaky at once. He said, finally, the word he had carried like bread, "I love you." And the room made more room for it without moving the walls. She did not cry. She did not gasp. She smiled and said, "I love you too." And the words did not echo. They landed and stayed. That night, the city hummed in a register his bones knew to be home. June slept with one hand open, an old childhood habit she had not outgrown. He slid his fingers into the curve, and they rested there. The exact weight that says we are here. The exact warmth that says we will be here tomorrow too. On the morning of the recital, the repaired building smelled of new paint and victory. Parents brought flowers wrapped in crackling paper. Children wore shoes that pinched and felt important for the pinch. June lined them up and spoke the words that make small bodies brave. Elio sat in the back row with other men who looked like they had unexpectedly found themselves in a life they were proud of. She conducted. They played. There were wrong notes played tenderly and therefore made right, and there were right notes played with such joy that the wrongness around them learned better manners. Midway through the second piece, the old piano's E key stuck. June didn't pause. She redirected a melody with a tilt of her chin, and the room, having spent months learning the difference between surrender and absorption, took the new path happily. The audience clapped the way people clap when they know they've witnessed something better than perfection. Courage. After, in the courtyard, one of the children ran up and said, "Miss June, I didn't hear the storm anymore." And June laughed and said, "That's because you drowned it out with your song." And the child nodded, as if that were the sort of physics the world should have taught earlier. They walked home with tulips in an unflattering plastic sleeve and a program folded carefully. On the bridge, with the river doing its patient work, Elio stopped and turned her gently to face him. He had something in his pocket, a small thing. Not a ring yet, not a contract. A charm shaped like a kite, silver, with a tail that caught the sun. "For your key," he said, "or for your pocket, or for the note on the fridge, for the part of you that likes to keep doors open." She took it with that specific care she gave things that mattered. "It's beautiful," she said, and then, because she had learned to speak the truth even when it shook, she added, "I'm not ready to promise in the way that requires ceremonies." "I'm not asking that," he said. "I'm asking only this. Let's keep choosing the true version of ourselves, and let the days be the ceremony." Her eyes softened, a tide coming in. "Yes," she said. "Yes." He kissed her, slow and sure, and the bridge did not roll its eyes at their sentiment. It held. At home, they hung the charm on the nail by the door where he kept the good umbrellas. It swayed and made a small song of its own. Later that evening, they watered the garden in the last of the light. He poured at the edges, and she laughed and said, "Look at you teaching water our language." And he said, "Look at us, absorbing, not surrendering." They ate pears and cheese and wiped juice from each other's wrists. They put on the old record, and the hiss was a friend by then, not a flaw. They danced in the kitchen, quiet feet on old wood. He whispered something into her hair that made her laugh, and also made her eyes do that shine that says the body is keeping, gentle, soft, soothing, tender, peaceful. The words were not philosophy, they were weather. They were the forecast he believed even when other maps argued. Before sleep, she stood by the window and whistled, a small, steady sound, and he, joining her, discovered that two people can whistle the same tune without spoiling it. The notes found each other in mid-air and went on together, not perfectly, but true. If this story found a corner of your day and made it softer, come back for the next gentle chapter. Drop a comment and subscribe so you'll be here when the music starts again.